Hi, folks. This will be a lecture that is going to try to combine some of the high points of two of the textbooks that are assigned for this week, Chapter 6 in the Gambrill text and Chapter 13 in the Hepworth text. Both of them talk about approaches to resolving problems, therapeutic approaches and techniques and things, and I just kind of thought the two of them blended together, and maybe we can pull this off in some sort of logical sequence here in this particular discussion. So first we talk a little bit about goal attainment strategies, and some of these slides are going to be from the Gambrill text and some from the Hepworth text. If you're wondering where the origins are in each of these, if you see the copyright at the bottom of this particular slide is Cengage Learning, that's that will tell you that this is mostly coming from the Hepworth text. I am editing these texts, these slides as I do each week when I do a lecture. So just so you know that sometimes I'm adding some things in here, but by and large, anything with the copyright in the bottom, you're going to reference to the chapter in the Hepworth text, and the ones that don't have anything about a copyright below it are actually slides that I put together based on content in the Gambrill text. So just so you know, if you want to read more about any of this information. So we start out looking a little bit about some of the strategies for planning goal attainment, and of course, change strategy with our client should be directed towards the problem that really is specified by the client. If it's a voluntary client, at least that we're working with. If we have an involuntary client, sometimes those problems are mandated by the court or by a child protection agency or some other government entity. If it's a minor child, sometimes that problem is mandated by the parent, defined by the parent, I should say. Now, that doesn't mean to say with involuntary clients we cannot find goals that they wish to pursue voluntarily, but that may not be the overall largest goal as far as our intervention is concerned. This depends a lot upon where we work and the agency's purpose. What your role is in the life of the client. What kind of change agent you are. Um, Systems or environmental issues that are implicated in the problem should also be involved in any change strategy, and there'll be more about this later, but that kind of speaks a little bit to the contextual view of assessment that particularly with Gambrill you're going to be hearing more and more about as the semester goes along. Working with diverse clients, of course, a sense of discovery and learning is very important in working with individuals from other cultures and other social groups that you may not be a member of. Cultural humility term that we've been talking about is something that's very important, that you're here to learn and to understand, not to teach and redirect somebody's views of what's right and what's wrong necessarily based on culture at least. So these kinds of approaches will help us in understanding our clients and to select a change strategy that fits with their particular cultural requirements as well. Now, ethical standards when we're selecting goals, of course, there are two big parts of the ethical model that are very important for us to keep in mind, and that's the client's right to self-determination and the client's right to informed consent. These are two things that we should be careful to safeguard as we go along this or go through this process with the client. And there's also a reference to technical eclecticism in the text that I just wanted to mention also, that we're going to be talking about a number of different intervention styles, and even within those intervention styles there are different specific let's say therapeutic models and techniques and such that one might use, and that really it's of benefit for you to have a number of different, if you want to call them tools in your toolbox or whatever, so that you can use the intervention that's best suited to your client and best suited to the particular presenting problem. Now, how we frame a problem, of course, is a critical aspect, really a key element in determining which direction we go. Now again, although you're going to rely upon the client or the agency that sent the client to you to kind of define the overall goal, nonetheless, how you approach the goal sometimes has something to do with how you're going to define what the problem is. And in our society, in the many different contexts that involve economic, political, and social dimensions that influences how we frame the problem is very critical to what kind of success the client's going to achieve. There are disparities in economics, health and healthcare, and education, and the whole tendency in our society to biomedicalize individuals' problems in living, as Gambrill refers to them, that everyday issues of behavior or whatever it might be somehow get turned into health problems that need the intervention of medical professionals, and that might include social workers in talking about medical professionals. And so this is one thing to be careful about, is to not necessarily to fall into identifying the problem as belonging to the individual in sort of a medical kind of a framework, when we have all these other kinds of situations to consider, such as the socioeconomic status of the client, what kind of resources are available to the client, what systems of oppression or privilege may be at play in the client's life, and so on. And even in agencies sending clients to you, how those problems are framed really has a lot to do with how we see problems in the current situation. There's sort of a social definition of problems that go on based upon the trends in our society as of late. And a question we have for this is, who benefits from the changes in definitions of problems, and who loses in that process? And a good example of that, to me, and I fall back a lot upon economics, as you know, when we talk about these kinds of things, is the whole idea of blaming poverty on the individual, that the welfare recipient or the food stamp recipient doesn't work, so therefore government focuses upon putting in work requirements, and somehow the voters are satisfied that we're holding individuals accountable for their own actions and this kind of thing, when really their condition of poverty probably has very little to do with many of those individuals are already working anyway, but have very little to do with their employment status. But that's sort of the popular definition of this, and of course, politically that's very popular for conservative leaders, and it helps them get votes and that kind of thing. So these kinds of questions, I think, are worth thinking about when we look at how problems are framed in everyday society. And as Gambrill suggests, we don't want to be engaged in problem setting. We want to be engaged in problem solving as much as possible. So, to give a name to a problem is to recognize or suggest the structure with which it will be dealt. So, is welfare recipients, are they lazy or uneducated, or are they victims of the economic structure that has inequitable distribution of housing, employment with decent wages, quality educational opportunities, those kinds of things? If you want to blame the individual, then you're going to focus upon job training and work requirements and that kind of thing. But if you're going to really look at the larger picture, you're going to start looking at the quality of the schools in the neighborhood, for instance, and what housing is available to individuals, and what does public transportation look like, and are there quality daycare centers available so that an individual could go to work and improve their lot. All of these kinds of things tell us how we define the problem, really also defines sort of the solutions we look at. So that's important to keep in mind. And policies and politics rather all tie into these issues so much, so that we can't really separate this discussion away from the political reality of the day. The conditions said to define the social problem are socially constructed and are only one of several possible realities. And this is an accompaniment to social control, to the quest for hegemony, I believe, that's dominance, essentially. And this is a quote that's in the Gambrill text, again pointing to the fact that how we see problems really is a social construction. And one way to challenge the system, I think, is to challenge that social construction in the public discussion that goes on with our leaders and in town hall meetings with our representatives and those kinds of things. Maybe kind of redirect those individuals to look at the other sides of these things. So Gambrill, is big on the contextual, the it's, well, I think we call it the person environment or the ecological idea, but it's even bigger than that. I believe in Gambrill's sense, we have to have a contextual understanding of what lies beneath or behind the client's issues. It's easy to fall into blaming clients and to focus on individual change, if and so much of what we do seems to point in that direction. But we need to consider the environmental factors that need to be altered as well. If we don't do this, political issues get transformed into biochemical problems. Behavior issues become mental health problems. Domestic violence blamed on the victim is, what could she have done differently, perhaps that he might not have been so angry or made so angry by her, that kind of thing. Or if we want to look at that from the perspective of the perpetrator, you know, uh, we can kind of turn the larger issue of patriarchy and male dominance and all that into a simple anger management problem. The perpetrator just goes to 8 sessions of anger management training and he's cured, and the little woman should go back to him, that kind of thing. These are all there certainly are very important social intervention issues, very important things for us to know how to treat properly, but there's a lot of politics in the way these things are viewed as well. And in a patriarchal society, you can bet that, for instance, changing the whole perception of domestic violence is something that's going to be, that the society as a whole will be resistant to that over a longer period of time. Likewise, when we talk about deviance, from a pure sociological standpoint, deviance is doesn't have any moral, let's say, or judgmental issues associated with it. It's just sort of it's a fact, a deviant. Deviant behavior is a behavior that strays from the norm. It isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'll give you an example of this. My youngest is in his early 20s, and he's back in Alaska. I'm still in Indiana. But, whenever I see a photograph of him on Facebook or elsewhere, his hair's a different color every time I see him. And I don't mean he goes from blonde to brunette. I mean he goes from red. And I don't mean auburn red. I mean like candy apple red to purple to green to bright yellow, maybe white. And that's just sort of been his thing for the last year and a half. And, everybody seems to accept it about him. And he has a lot of fun with it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, But that's really kind of a deviant behavior. It's something, it's out of the norm. It attracts attention, which I suspect is why he does it. People look at him and notice him and those kinds of things. And he kind of makes a statement that he's his own person. And that, again, that's a sort of a thinking of a deviant person. I'm not fitting in. I'm going to be my own self. Nothing wrong with any of that. It's just purely neutral, let's say, from a moral standpoint or a legal standpoint. And yet, when we talk about deviance in society, deviance in this culture is different from deviance in other cultures in terms of what's acceptable and what isn't, you know. And so deviant behaviors can be defined as law violations. They can be defined as sinful. They can be defined as mental health problems, or they can just be defined as none of the above. And another example, of course, is in the during the I was in the university and college during the Vietnam War, and there was just a lot of stress and worry among this population, about getting drafted and those things, and when you get into periods of time where there's high stress like that, sometimes there's just kind of bizarre little things that go on that that distract you from it and make you think about other things and have fun. And for a while during that period of time, streaking became a very big deal, and it wasn't uncommon to, well, it had to be uncommon or it wouldn't have been deviant, but I mean, it was not an uncommon deviant behavior to have somebody streak the dining hall at the university every now and then, and they usually have something over their face so nobody knew who it was, theoretically at least, but just running nude, and everybody kind of stands and cheers and claps and they laugh and everything thinks it's funny. Now, take that same situation and say, first of all, the person's not running, the person's strolling, and it's not in a cafeteria filled with people of the same age, but maybe they're walking down the hall in the administration building, in the middle of the day. And what's going to happen to that person? He'll get arrested, or she, but probably he, will get arrested and hauled off to jail and be charged with some, crime about indecent exposure or something like that. Here's the same behavior in different circumstances, even in the same culture, that is defined differently. So this tells you a little bit about deviant behavior and and the fact that it is very, very relative. And so that's something to keep in mind, I suppose. I don't know, I'm probably overemphasizing this a little bit, but it just goes to tell you that the context and of course the culture also has a lot to do with it. For instance, nudity is a lot more accepted in other cultures than it is in our own, that kind of thing. And so really, deviance is a social construction as well, and dependent upon group and cultural circumstance and definitions. So Gambrill talks a little bit about levels of focus for interventions, and she has 5 levels identified. Starting with the individual, personal, moving on through the family, and then gradually moving through larger and larger systems until we wind up in the larger political, social, economic sphere of policies and legislation. And actually, she says, you'll find social workers in their practice, and I believe this is very true. We tend to focus on level 1 and 2 interventions. So we're working with the individual or the family, occasionally, sometimes reaching into the community. But level 1 and 2 seems to be, our profession's comfort zone, so to speak. And it's also the one where, as we've talked about, or I talked about earlier, that it's also the one where you're going to get compensated for as you go further up these levels. More and more and more. You have to have a really narrowly defined kind of position with a specified agency, I think, to be able to make a living, intervening on those larger levels alone. Certainly, what happens is a lot of us wind up working mostly in level 1 and 2, but intervening in other levels as well, on the side, more or less, or in addition to that. But there's a lot of suggestion that the emphasis on the individual, the source of problem, explains the overrepresentation of poor and minority individuals in our institutions, basically because of blaming the victim for the problem. And again, as we define our intervention, we define the focus of our intervention. In a lot of ways, we're defining the problem, and so just keep that in mind. That as we focus on level 1 and 2, there are larger aspects to the problem that we need not to forget and not to allow ourselves or others to get into where we see the individual as the cause of the problem and the only solution to the problem. As we know, discrimination and oppression based on skin color, gender, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical abilities, all these things are every age as well, and physical appearance. These are all everyday realities for individuals in minority groups. Now again, and also in the majority, but again, when I talk about minority, I'm talking about power more than numbers. Dominance versus non-dominant, that kind of thing. Hepworth talks about covert interactions in Hepworth's book, really referring to what we've also talked about, microaggressions, where situations where people are treated differently because of these characteristics, sometimes in very, very subtle ways, so that it's not always obvious and sometimes even deniable, but the victim of the microaggression knows it and feels it, and so that's something we have to keep in mind, that if that individual feels this, then it's real. It isn't something that's in their imagination. So we should acknowledge in our work with clients and minority groups that these covert interactions exist and create stress on an everyday level for individuals. Even though individuals are dealt uneven hands at birth, the popular view in our society is that it's lack of individual initiative and responsibility that creates problems and adds to those problems. And here are some of the structural issues that really have something to do far beyond the individual's doing or not doing. Such things as how wealth is concentrated in the hands of the upper class, and yet that class also through the media really kind of generates a desire on the part of all of us, the middle class and the working class and poor people, urban and rural alike, young and old, to want to participate in the economy and to purchase and to buy, and yet we're denied that wealth because the wealth is not distributed equally. You know, there's lack of employment opportunities. Jobs may be out there, and I know that there's been a lot of emphasis placed on the fact that the unemployment rate is so low, and yet there are a lot of people who are not even looking for work, and so they're not being counted in the unemployment statistics. And there's a lot of people who are working part-time and working below their capacity because that's the job they could get, also not included in unemployment statistics. And so the stats the government issues, it doesn't necessarily speak to everything that's going on. And the real opportunities for individuals to work at a job that gives them a decent living are much more limited than our leadership wants us to believe. And that includes both the Democratic and Republican leadership, by the way. Educational opportunities are very uneven based on social and economic class. If you've had class with me before, you have probably read Jonathan Kozel's article, Savage Inequalities, and this is another classic sociological article that I think dates back into the 1990s, as I recall, and he compares the school system in East St. Louis, Missouri, with a school in one of the Long Island communities, among wealthy kids, and kind of shows the differences in those environments and the differences in what's available to students at the same age, but in two different social and economic classes, and how it's very obvious that the students in Long Island have privilege and advantage, and the students in East St. Louis have little to no opportunity, much less any hope for the future. Conditions in inner cities with limited economic opportunities, health problems related to inequalities and unequal access to health care. Of course, the health problems, the health insurance is more than simply being able to pay your bills. It's also, does one pursue health care that's needed, for prevention purposes, or that is likely to keep someone from getting sicker? If someone does get sick, do they go get help, or do they stay down and stay sick because they can't afford to get medical help? Missing work and missing school and all the kinds of problems that generates in the long run as well, as far as opportunity is concerned. For members of minority groups, any given level of achievement requires greater effort and provides fewer opportunities. This is something we've already been talking about in class as well. Different views of behavior have different consequences in relation to how people are treated. Different views of behavior have different consequences in relation to how people are treated. A very key concept, something for us to keep in mind. We have to be very careful about making analyses of an individual situation, our client or otherwise, and making it too simple, because we're not going to understand the big picture if we don't really take a look at the bigger context of those problems. There are always multiple levels of causality in these problems. Now we're going to be talking about, I think, theories of behavior and really theories of also treatment interventions and those kinds of things for the remainder of this lecture, and just some things to keep in mind. Gambrill points that there are the differences in these theories. There are a number of different things, in terms of the degree to which the behavior is viewed as knowable. Can you really define the problem or not? Incidentally, Gambrill is very big on behavioral interventions, this evidence-based practice. Really, behavioral interventions very much fall into what's acceptable with evidence-based, because you're talking about things you see in behaviors, and and you can document and track and those kinds of things. And so that's a knowable kind of thing versus, and although there are scales out there for measuring depression and self-esteem, improving one's self-esteem maybe is less knowable to a degree, you know what I'm saying? And so really how we well, the degree to the behavior is viewed as knowable differs from one intervention to another, one particular style of intervention to another. So that tells us, what goals to pursue, what is it acceptable, in an evaluation. Gambrill points out at this point or sometime before long, she'll be talking about diagnoses and how you send somebody for psychological evaluation, you get a diagnosis, and it's sort of done. Oh, okay, so they're borderline personality disorder. So that means X, Y, and Z in terms of what we can expect from the client, and A, B, and C in terms of what we should do in terms of intervention. Case solved. Do those things, and things will work out as best they can. Now that's oversimplifying things, of course, and I know it's much more complex than that, but that's sort of what a diagnosis does, is sort of seen as sort of an endpoint more or less, whereas in an assessment we really are looking at the diagnosis is just one part of a bigger assessment, and we're looking at the context and the environment and those kinds of things. In a way, I think the assessment is the beginning of the process, not the end. And so she warns us against diagnosing and relying too much on diagnoses, certainly as an end to an intervention. The range of problems addressed. I mean, I don't need to read these things to you, but you can see that there are a number of different factors involved in how a problem is framed. Again, depending upon the particular theory of behavior that you're using to underlie your intervention. By the way, if you look at the last few bullet points in this list, you're looking at how much critical testing of claims is possible, what's the empirical support, what kind of connection is there between theory and knowledge. This is some of this points towards evidence-based practice. Now, Gambrill's description of behaviors is kind of a more general kind of a thing. I think Hepworth gets into more specifics, although again his classifications are rather general as well. But these are broader definitions. Theories of behavior. She looks at physical explanation, and she breaks physical explanations into three categories, and one is genetic. And some years ago, I taught several semesters actually of a men and masculinity class at Kenai Peninsula College, and that was a lot of fun. That was really one of my most favorite classes ever. And when we talk about what makes what explains male behavior and those kinds of things, one of those theories, of course, sociobiological theory. And if you ever want to just have a lot of fun, I don't know. I'm not. If you're a sociobiologist, please forgive me. But I mean, it's rooted in biology, and so they point to a lot of the fact that this is like this talks about maybe our hardwiring, not our not the kinds of things that impact us through development, but how we're hardwired. And some of the theories of sociobiologists come up, just especially in context of men and masculinity. It was just a lot of fun to teach, like this concept of why is it that the old double standard that men can sleep around and they're considered more masculine the more sexual partners they have, whereas women, at least by the old standards, the more women slept around, that was not a good thing for them in terms of their reputation, and why the difference. And sociobiologists would tell you that indeed men can and should sleep around. Men can sleep around because, well, women, once a woman gets pregnant, she's out of circulation for 9 months. In terms of, now think of this in terms of contributing to the survival of the species. Okay, she can produce a baby, no more often than once every 9 months, and actually probably, some extra time beyond that, so that, maybe once a year or something less than that, a woman can produce offspring. Whereas a man, during that year, can be going around making all sorts of different offsprings, so for the survival of the species, it's a good thing that men sleep around. This is that's not how the sociobiologists teach it, but that's kind of how I just kind of see it, and I thought it was kind of fun to look at that. So sociobiological theories just kind of give you a few chuckles if you need some chuckles. And they do say that reproductive success is the main determinant of the development of traits. Why is it that having been and any of you men out there who or like me, I mean, if you were a geek in high school like me, that it seemed like the football players are the ones that got the girls, and the geeks weren't all that successful. And why was that? Well, because, the sociobiologists say because the boys that are out there, playing these rough and tumble sports and are, have the big V shape in their body, they have that real masculine kind of build and everything, that they have stronger genes. And so it is good for the species. It is survival of the species things that girls are attracted to them because their offspring are more likely to be strong as well. It kind of made me feel like the geek, sort of like the little caribou that was running behind the herd that got ate by the wolves, maybe, because he couldn't keep up. But of course, the now sociologists are going to tell you that the geeks are the ones who make the better mate, the better partner in the long run, because they're the ones that are going to give a more stable, pursue a more stable lifestyle and have more stable income. And whereas the athletes are, their physical prowess is going to peak early and go downhill after that. And if that's what they base their success on, they'll be losers later. And so I'm sorry, just having been a geek, I had to say that. So anyway, I'm digressing here, but sociobiologists think the behavior is influenced primarily by our genetic differences, and that what on a more serious note, then this makes patterns of inequality a biological inevitability. And there have been some pretty harmful kinds of theories out there about was it phrenology, I think was the term with a ph, phrenology, about how the shape of a skull has something to do with intellectual level and things like that. And it just so happened that the shape of the skull that that had to do with lower intelligence was the shape of the African American or the African skull. And I mean, just a lot of things like that where this can be turned against people. But again, this is one theory that because especially given that we're talking about hardwiring, it really can kind of wind up blaming the individual and pigeonholing people. um, and even for when you consider environmental influences, the epigenetic view holds that environment influences are a key contributor to gene expression, that the environment permits or encourages certain genes to be expressed and keeps others from being expressed. But nonetheless, the genes have a lot to do with what happens according to the genetic view. The biomedical view, we talked about and will be talking about throughout the semester. Behavior disorders, mental illnesses are identified as a medical problem, sometimes due to chemical imbalances. And so, once again, this puts the focus on the individual as the cause of the problem. And this happens to fit very well with a capitalist philosophy of individual responsibility. The idea that, anybody can succeed if they only try. If they only work harder, they can be rich just like the Rockefellers and that kind of thing. This all fits with capitalism and that Western sensibility about individual responsibility. And Gambrill questions, and I think this is a good point, that if indeed these mental illnesses and brain disorders have something to do with a brain dysfunction, why isn't the psychiatrists the ones who are doing the treatment? It should be a neurologist, but they're not typically. Then developmental explanations, if you haven't already, and some of you had actually had our developmental course with me, a few of you did, and if you haven't had that course yet, you'll have it before you get your MSW. And it's a very popular lifespan development views are very popular in the social work field, as is pointed out here. This holds that individual development through our life transitions are contingent on the environment, but there's a lot of emphasis upon the environment. I think that's one of the things that makes it attractive to the social work profession, and yet there's a lot of disagreements about how much emphasis should be placed on genes or environment and the interactions of the individual organism with the environment. Um, Generally, our profession holds that the individual impacts the environment as the environment impacts the individual. But there's a lot of, I guess, a lot of debate and discussion about that, and once again, it's a lot of debate and discussion about everything in our field. But these kind of marker variables that she refers to: social class, age, connect with a lot of problems, but they don't explain them. And so it's, once again, it seems that there are other forces at work beyond the individual life transitions and things that individuals go through. Now she moves into cognitive explanation from physical explanations, and behavioral focuses where we look at behaviors, and she says even bizarre behaviors serve adaptive functions when they're reinforced. And so she talks a lot about, in her text, you'll see her repeatedly talk about the kid that's diagnosed as being hyperactive because the teacher says they're hyperactive. And this is one of her cases for observing behaviors directly, individually. You getting into classroom and sitting down and making observations. That what you find a lot of times with these hyperactive behaviors, that supposedly this kid may have attention deficit disorder and needs medication. You find out that those behaviors really are reinforced by the teacher's attention, and that if you change the way the teacher interacts with the child, which incidentally turns out to be much harder than you would think, if you change the way the teacher interacts with the child, those behaviors change without medication oftentimes. So there are adaptive functions to troubling behaviors. So you have to discover the relationship between the behavior and their consequences, she says, and also the antecedents, what comes before it, what sets up that behavior to occur. And sometimes if you get in there and change the antecedents or the consequences, or both, you can change the behavior and be considered a genius, I suppose, in a school setting. I mean, I for a while I fostered a kid who I was placed with me for adoption. I didn't finalize the adoption because it was just too much for me. I had another boy I was raising, and I couldn't manage him by myself. And plus, it was around the time we moved to Alaska, and I would be pulling him away from his resources, and so it never got beyond the foster stage. But he was came to me diagnosed as hyperactive, with ADHD, and was on Ritalin when he came to me. And the first thing I heard from his teacher, he was in, I think, fifth grade, was the first message I got from his teacher, quite literally, was, "Please do not change his medication." And it gave me the sense that the medication was as much for the teacher as it was for the poor little boy. But in any event, there are explanations, behavioral explanations. The behaviors are learned and maintained through reinforcement, and so seeing this helps us to avoid negatively labeling our client when we can see what it is that sets these behaviors up and maintains them. There are fields of theory that cognitions play a causal role in explaining behaviors and feelings. Well, they call it radical behaviorism. I call it sensible behaviorism. Social learning theories also, a reciprocal interaction between people and their environment is assumed, that we both influence and are influenced by our environment. I don't think there's much question about that personally. And don't forget, gender, class, culture, race, all these kinds of things have an influence on how certain behaviors are viewed or our rights to engage in them. And a good example, I think this comes from the Gambrill text, but that white middle class people purchase prescribed medications to alter their moods. Yet if you're an African American youth living in a poor neighborhood in a city somewhere, you get arrested and imprisoned for using street drugs for the very same purpose. Contextual explanations is something that Gambrill is, I think, and we should be, very much in support of, that highlight the interactions between people and the environment. Both personal and environmental characteristics are considered important and mutually influential. Now, this is quite similar to the ecological model, as this slide points out. Different levels of our environment have a unique characteristics and have influences on other levels within the environment as well. So if you go back to that 5 levels of intervention, was the individual, the family, the the social community, and the political, socioeconomic. There was another one in the middle. I'm just losing it at the moment, but these have influences on each others as well, depending upon where the individual is located. There's no question that the personal and the social are interlinked, and this. I also the contextual explanation also places emphasis upon our multiple identities. That we function differently depending upon where we are, what group we're in. Sometimes we're more self assured than in others. Sometimes we speak up more often than others. Think of yourself at the dinner table expressing your political views versus, being in the classroom expressing your political views. It's a whole different kind of a thing, and has something to do with the context of that particular moment. And this is true for just about everything involving us. So that when we appreciate this connection between us, or the person and the environment, and the person and the political, and the person and the social, this helps us to avoid focusing on psychological and biological characteristics of the client, which blames the individual, and allows us to not overlook the important influence of the environment when we're looking at how to go about changing things, helping the client change things. A little bit well, not a little bit. We're going to spend most of the rest of the time here talking about Hepworth's models of intervention, and there's actually 5 models plus the case management practice, or 4 if you consider trauma-informed care not a model actually, but more of an influence that overlays all of them. But each of these approaches comply with, Hepworth points out, comply with the social work code and with social work philosophies of collaboration with clients, and adhere to the principles of our professional practice involving utilizing client strengths and increasing client self-efficacy. So we're going to walk through these kinds of models. We're just going to do that, walk through them little by little here. So the task-centered model is the first one he talks about, that is aimed at reducing problems and living with within a brief time limited period. This is not a long period, but is a shorter intervention. And by task centered, it means, instead of looking at personality change, we're looking at, what's the problem here and how do we go about fixing this? What do we do about this particular issue? Let's determine what the steps are. So the client identifies primary concerns, and we collaborate with them to try to find the best route to resolving those concerns. You can use all sorts of different kinds of technique involved in treating and using the task-centered model. That's one of the good things about the model. So so that's a good thing, I think. What not only works for you, but also what fits with the client. It does have empirical validity with different client populations, and it also has a tendency to engage the client because it's focused upon a certain concrete goal. And it's kind of less intimidating, I think, to many clients in that respect. It talks about where it can be utilized, and applied to social work practice with involuntary clients and child welfare and minors in school settings. It can be used in just about any kind of a setting. I'm not sure why. I mean, I wouldn't want to limit it to the kinds of things they talk about where it's utilized, but perhaps these are where the studies have been done that show that it can be effective. But again, the emphasis here is upon the right of the clients to identify concerns, which is a very good thing, and is one of those things that is a theme throughout our course. And that includes clients who are involuntary, by the way, but more about that later. Start with broader goals. We identify specific tasks that take us towards those goals. And the sequence here, it says, first of all, enhance the client's commitment to carry out the tasks. You have to assess whether or not the client really does want to do this. And this is where working with the involuntary client becomes more challenging to you. If you have a voluntary client, that's the commitment's going to be there. But with an involuntary client, you may have to use some techniques in order to engage the client, in order to help enhance the client's motivation. And we'll be looking at some of that later, like motivational interviewing and some of those things that might be used to enhance the client's commitment. You plan the details of carrying out the tasks. You look at the barriers and obstacles, and this is the key thing. And it's one way I could always tell. It really was, something I noticed among my staff that when I had people with social work degrees in child protection, and this isn't true about all of them, and it doesn't mean that other degrees weren't useful either. I don't want to, I don't want to say it wasn't the case, but by and large, social work people trained in social work get this piece kind of inherently. That if the client's not doing what the client said he or she was going to do, you don't just say, you need to do this or whatever, you give up. You try to find out what's stopping, what's the barrier, and then you work to help the client overcome those barriers, whatever they may be. And sometimes it isn't within the client. Sometimes it has something to do with how the family responds to change or those kinds of things, the environment around the client. But I've seen people a lot of times without social work degrees who don't get this piece. It's really up to the client to change, and if the client doesn't change, then so be it. So part of our job is to help to analyze and resolve barriers and obstacles, rehearsing and practicing behaviors involved in the task. So when the client goes out, that they've got some skill in doing this, and then summarizing the task plan. But we have to look at when tasks aren't completed, a number of different reasons for that to happen, and we need to look at those reasons and try to find ways to overcome those barriers. So that's one of the strengths of this model is that we identify those obstacles and resolve them. There is empirical evidence supporting the efficacy of this model. And again, that action orientation in this particular model is something that's appealing to a lot of different clientele. And this says racial and ethnic minorities. And I think this is true for a lot of clients, not just racial and ethnic minorities. Now, one thing about this, because it's brief treatment kind of interventions. And by brief treatment, that doesn't mean you only meet for 3 sessions and never see the client again. Brief treatment may mean there'll be a whole series of times when you get together for a few weeks and then you don't see each other, and then you do again and then you don't. But in any event, this sustained therapeutic relationship isn't going to evolve as easily in this kind of a model, just because of the fact that you don't have that long-term kind of relationship. So that if you're an individual who really relies upon that, the therapeutic relationship model of motivating the client, you might need to develop some other skills to help you use this model. And interestingly, even though it says the model is supported by empirical evidence in multiple settings, it says there's limited evidence to support the utilization and the effectiveness of the model. So I don't know what to tell you about that. Crisis intervention is another model, and this is really, it's kind of just as it says. It's focused upon intervening with clients at times when there is a crisis in a client's life, and to help that client get back to a place where they're functioning at a level that is relatively equal to their pre-crisis state. Now, there's different kinds of crises, and we're going to touch on that in a second, but I mean, like you have a crisis, let's say there's an earthquake, and you have to help a client deal with the after effects of that, and the psychological impact of whatever that might have occurred. It's sort of a concrete thing that happens and it's done. Whereas other situations, crises can be like kind of repeated kinds of situations. Living in a crisis situation, for instance, living in a war zone, for instance, is an example of that. But there's also ones that, in Alaska, you're more likely to see, like living in an abusive home, for instance, that kind of situation. And so, prolonged crisis-related stressors have a potential to severely affect all different levels of our functioning, and so that's something to keep in mind. Now, crisis intervention, that particular model also emphasizes a brief intervention period. The slide that I got said 4 to 8 weeks of crisis work. Sometimes it's just one crisis session, depending again upon your role in the setting in which you 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 approach the client and who the client is, and for that matter. So they can range from a single session telephone intervention to comprehensive services with an entire community, even for that matter. Um, the critical incident stress debriefing interventions you may have heard about, where a professional engages with a group of, let's say, ambulance attendants who responded to a scene where, like, five adolescents were killed in a car accident or something like that. They take this stuff home with them, and they probably don't talk with their family about it. All the kinds of things they saw. And so the CISD, I think, critical incident stress debriefing team, kind of get together and kind of help them work through those things. And that's a particular technique. It's actually, there's been some question, I guess, I've read recently, that whether or not that's as effective as it was once believed it is. But there's a different kind of approach to crisis intervention, and something you want to study up if you ever want to do that, specifics of that, because it's different from what you do with other clients. But in any event, focuses on the present. Goals are limited to alleviating distress and assisting the client to regain psychological equilibrium. And that's what the tasks are focused on. So actually, I think ensuring client safety would be the number one step here, but they say defining the problem is number one, and then ensure client safety. Um, Looking at providing support, examining alternatives, um, planning, getting a commitment from the client to follow through, and then anticipatory guidance. When that client leaves you, trying to make sure that the client's got some skills, that if this thing happens again or certain kind of predictable things recur, how are you going to deal with that? What are you going to do? Who are you going to turn to? Those kinds of things. Here are some of the strengths and limitations that Hepworth talks about in his book. One limitation, and I had to kind of get back in and kind of redefine what the slide was saying here, but when you have ongoing problems with cognitive, affective, and behavioral functioning, say from a long-term stressful environment and things like this, um, the idea of restoring the client to previous psychological functioning, that equilibrium, may be kind of out of reach. When we're talking about when an individual has really experienced significant problems because of this, particularly in situations of longer term kind of crisis kinds of things, it may be an unrealistic goal, but that's still the direction you want to go, at least, to increase the client's ability to deal with circumstances. Cognitive restructuring is another model that Hepworth talks about, and there are a variety of different kinds of specific therapies, rational emotive therapy, et cetera, that fit into this model of cognitive behavior therapy. But again, this is sort of a broader classification of interventions here. So this theory really looks at our behaviors as originating from how we process internal and external information, how we process this information. And the aim is to change thoughts, feelings, and overt behaviors that contribute and maintain behavior. So if you kind of think of this in the ABC model, what comes, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. Well, actually, it's the antecedent and I forget what the B. It's not behavior, but in any event, something happens. A, B, the individual has thoughts. C, there is an emotional response, which leads to a behavioral response. And so in cognitive restructuring, you're looking at that B stage, that thinking and things like this, those thoughts, and working to alter any kind of maladaptive thinking that leads to problem behaviors and emotions and things like that. So this holds that thoughts, our thinking, is a primary determinant of behavior, and that those cognitions affect our behavior which are response, which have to do with why we act the way we do. So in order to change behaviors, you work with your clients to find ways to change their thinking errors, their misconceptions. Problems occur when our thoughts are consistently distorted because of our ingrained beliefs and our faulty reasoning. And, depending upon what particular model you're using, what kind of theory you're using, I mean, there are some models that have just a lengthy list of thinking errors that lead to, problem behaviors and problem emotions and things like this. I remember Albert Ellis's basic model of rational motive therapy really had, I think, three classifications. They were shoulds, I should have done something, or he should be doing something. Awfuls, which means like it's not, things aren't just bad, but it's the end of the world. Everything gets blown up, a mountain out of a molehill. And shoulds, awfuls, and can't stands. That I can't stand something, and of course, when you can't stand something, that means it's going to kill you, and it's obviously unlikely to kill you, so you can stand it. So you work with those. Well, and I've seen many descriptions in other models that have many, many more kind of classifications of thinking errors, but I always like that simple model. And in fact, I used that model when I was working in a residential program with behavior disordered adolescents, and we use the RET model to help them modify some of their behaviors. And I will say, at least in the setting where I was working, that there was some success at that. I mean, just in conversations with the kids, I could see them, in talking with me, after they were trained in the model and everything, some weeks later, and we're having a counseling session, and they're talking, and so and so did something, and I can't really stand it well, I can stand it, but I mean, I don't like when they do such and such. And it was just kind of like an automatic thing, and it was very rewarding to see kids changing their thoughts without any prompting. It was really kind of cool to see that happen. And now, how long that happened after they left, I don't know. But we didn't do follow up studies, unfortunately. But so there's the basic idea behind cognitive restructuring. And then schemas, perhaps, are patterns of thought that we use to organize our information, and when we have these negative schemas, then based upon certain events or things that's happening around us, that can really lead to maladaptive behaviors on an ongoing basis. So I think a schema is, it's not just a negative or a maladaptive thought or a thinking error, but it's a whole error of a way of seeing the world, so to speak. And different kinds of problems that can be treated. One of the things that's not mentioned here is depression, and that cognitive behavioral intervention is something that's, I think depression, they had documented quite a bit of success with that as well. I'm not sure how that was missed in here, but the nice thing about cognitive restructuring is it's a simple process, by the way. It's something you really teach your clients to learn and use, and that's why Ellis developed it. In fact, he was frustrated with the fact that psychiatrists had people on couches for years and years and years, and it just kind of created this dependent relationship in a psychiatrist. And Ellis wanted to treat I think his patients were in a psychiatric hospital, wanted to treat them and teach them how to change their thinking so that they didn't have to come back to the hospital and they didn't need psychiatrists anymore. And that's kind of how that all started. So, you're going to teach clients not only about their thinking errors, but also self statements, because that can lead to low self esteem. And, what are the assumptions and beliefs about the world around us? This is one of the things by the way, in batterers intervention, which is not anger management, but batterers intervention. One of the things they do is they have batterers in their groups look at their thinking errors about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what men can expect of women, what are the beliefs about, what a husband should get from a wife, and those kinds of things. And the thinking behind that is that, when you restructure those kind of basic thoughts, really that underlie the entitlement, the sense of entitlement that is behind battering women, you can really change things. And so I think that cognitive restructuring is personally, I think it's a very powerful intervention. So again, you can see many of the kinds of things that can be used for. Useful in altering perceptions and distorted beliefs and thought patterns, and to remove cognitive barriers. It says it doesn't equip clients with the skills required to perform new behaviors, and I suppose I guess that's true. You have to do some other things. I don't think you can just kind of get in there and change thinking patterns. It's like when you're trying to tell somebody stay away from this group of kids that are leading into bad behaviors, but then you do nothing to help that kid find another group to engage with. When you take away something, you have to replace it with something else with you know and so I think if we're going to change their thought patterns so they don't engage in their dysfunctional behaviors in the future, then when we correct those thought patterns, we have to help them find some new behaviors instead. And that may mean, some social training and things like that. Some groups might perceive cognitive restructures as blaming or another form of social control, and again, depending upon the particular group and the context of your work, that's something to consider. Solution focused brief treatment. This is very much like task centered work in some respects, except that it doesn't focus on the problem, it focuses on a solution. And while that sounds like semantics, it's really a uh, very powerful difference. In child protection, we were reading, I forget the name of her book now, I have it here somewhere. Imsu Kim Berg wrote a book on the use of solution focused interventions with child protection clients. And this is one area where this can be used with some success. And it's outside the realm and the scope of this lecture or even this class to be able to give you too much in the specifics of this, but this is a model I think, worth learning more about. It emphasizes identifying solutions, drawing on your client's strengths and capacities, of course, with the intent of empowering them to create their own solutions, and asserting that the clients have a right to determine their desired outcomes. Clients are referred to as customers, complainants, and visitors. That's not unlike earlier we were talking about, what was it? We had clients, we had oh golly, resistors and applicants. I think it's the same. I think the same differentiation there, and so knowing which group your client belongs to tells you a little bit about what work you're going to want to do with them. But the theory says that reality is constructed by culture and context and perceptions and life experience, so there is no such thing as an absolute truth. And what the worker does is to help the client question self-defeating constructions and to construct more productive perspectives. And so the focus really is on solution talk, not about focusing on problems, how they started or how they were perpetuated. I don't know that you really do much about talking about the past so much in this as what are we going to do about the situation that you have here. So, a problem is defined as the client's account. And while the client describes the problem, the worker is listening for ways to guide the thinking towards a solution, away from the problem and towards a solution for the problem. And then goals are developed. The question being, what will be different when the problem no longer exists? That's how we define the goal. Where do we want to go? What exceptions have occurred in the past to this problem? When did you succeed? When did this problem not exist, and what were you doing then? How did you handle things in those days? Can you do that now? What is it that that we can do so that you can do that again? End of session feedback. The client, rather, to where you the worker compliments the client and reinforces what the client's already done to solve the problem. Some of the steps, for instance, let's say with a out of control adolescent, and you've got a client who's brought this teenager to you and says, I can't keep her anymore. I want you to take her. And you'll run into that if you ever work in child protection more times than you can shake a stick at. And so So the parent has just lost it and doesn't know what to do. But there have been times in the past when where the parent has, in one way or another, been successful in dealing with the problem, even if it just kind of forestalled, you know, kicking the kid out. What did the client do? And find ways to compliment the client for having the courage to do those things, and trying in the face of adversity to continue. Yeah. And then finally evaluating progress. And this is an ongoing process. What, from the client's perspective, at the beginning, what needs to happen for it to be better? And later on, what is better? What's changed now? And there are questions, different kind of solution focused questions that are used in this process. So the scaling questions, where you have the client essentially, how willing are you to work on this problem, a scale 1 to 10, how confident are you that we can do something about this, that kind of thing. And you keep using those scaling questions throughout the intervention, so the client sees change. Coping questions, so you give credit to the client's prior efforts to manage the difficulty. Exception questions, when in life did this problem not exist? And miracle questions, the miracle question, what's going to be different when your goal's achieved? The solution, when you get the solution, how's life going to look to you then? And that creates hope and motivation. That's a technique. I encourage you. Sue Kimberg, if you're not familiar with this, IM and SOOKIMBERG, four separate words. I something For some reason I believe she has died. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I don't believe she's with us anymore. But she she was living in Michigan for a period of time, working up there, and I can't think of the name of the book, but it's a book that's worth reading. Solution focused brief treatment has a lot of strengths, including the very practical procedures and questions that are easy to learn and applied in many different kinds of situations of practice. As I said, it was being touted in child protection circles for some time, until somebody came along with some other model they liked better, which happens when you work for the state, but that's another story. Emphasis on client strengths and attributes. There's definite emphasis on positives in this particular intervention, and really kind of looking at the future rather than the past. But focusing on solutions can really be disconcerting for a lot of or a lot of clients who kind of think about their life in terms of problems, and maybe that positive thrust keeps them from talking about their real concerns. That could be an issue. Something to think about. And also, this is a limited attention rather to behaviors ignores the connection between feelings and cognitions. In some respects, some people consider this to be a more superficial intervention, and is it like kind of taking your car through the car wash and not cleaning the interior? I don't know. I suppose that depends a lot upon what kind of long-term studies there are out there about it. A few slides on trauma-informed care, and again, this isn't a particular model so much as it is something that you want to keep in mind. I think in your general work, using any model of intervention and a trauma-informed approach, that you'll get more training on this, certainly in a social work program, and this is just a brief talk about it, and also in your job, hopefully, particularly with some of the positions you might have, like child protection and adult protection. This is very important. It's an awareness of the impact and consequences of trauma exposures and of a history across settings and populations. It's person-centered and strengths-based in its service delivery. And again, it recognizes the presence of trauma and how it impacts clients' lives. A great example of trauma informed thinking, at least in our social work, is foster homes. There's a prohibition against use of any kind of corporal punishment whatsoever, in terms of discipline when discipline is necessary, and trying to comply with that. One of our foster families was had a habit of when this little girl was acting out and needed some correction, of removing some of her toys and some of the things that she enjoyed until a certain period of time passed where she wasn't engaging in those behaviors anymore and they could be returned to her. Well, what they came to the worker with was the problem that she didn't reach that period, and it just kept escalating and escalating and escalating. And when they sat down and they talked about this little girl's history, one of the things that they noticed with the worker was is that her life's been a series of losses. I mean, she lost her family because she was removed from her family. She's lost her friends, lost her teacher because she had to move to a new community to find a foster home that would work with her. She didn't have her pet with her anymore, and those kinds of things. And so for that child, there was a series of traumas in the removal, and there were other losses even before she was removed from her family that I'm not privy to, but she's had a series of losses in her life, and so for that particular child, removing items as a correction really kind of regenerated all of those feelings about those losses and the trauma that they created, and it exacerbated the problem instead of correcting it. And so this is just one example of what trauma informed care requires of a worker. It's something where you have to look at clients that have lived in trauma or have experienced trauma and understand that it impacts the way they see the world. And not only in terms of trauma like loss and things like this, but also, the kinds of things we study about with cultural trauma and historical issues and gender issues and those kinds of things as well. These are all things to be considered in working with people. Now, there are different types of trauma, different levels of trauma, so that a type 1 trauma is the individual retains complete memory of the experience, and that does imply an ability at some point or other, when the client's ready, by the way, not before, to be able to process and work through that stuff and talk about it and perhaps, be able to move on. Type 2 is really more about repetitive and prolonged exposure to trauma with intense reactions, and these might be kids that are in abusive homes or women, who have been in abusive relationships. Um, you know, Perhaps like living in a community where um, they're living in a war zone, for instance. Although I think that almost kind of fits more with type 3, which is these multiple pervasive violent events from childhood through adulthood. So there are biological, psychological, social, spiritual impacts. Um, there have been documentations that show that the neurobiology of the brain changes because of trauma. And this includes individuals who don't necessarily directly um, experience, aren't really directly connected to the physical trauma itself. An example of this, Linda Chamberlain will tell you in her training about brain development, that there are studies that show that infants in a crib, in a room or two away from an argument where there's repeated arguments between mother and father, and maybe some physical abuse going on, infants in a crib a room or two away, who have been exposed to this kind of thing over and over and over again, actually have changes in their brain physiology. So that was the whole question about, we know that children who observe domestic violence are impacted negatively, but workers used to say, well, the child didn't observe, the child was in the next room or whatever. Well, there's evidence to suggest that even being in the next room, the child is impacted in a very real way by violence around the child. So all sorts of kind of things that might explain behaviors that you don't really understand sometimes, overreactions perhaps with your clients, or they don't respond in certain ways that you might expect. One of the things we might do is kind of look at their history as far as trauma is concerned, and there's a lot of different things that determine the impact of trauma, so that different individuals experience things differently based on their age and stage of development, how severe the traumatic event was. And again, severity is a it's a very personal very personal description. So you may not think something's very severe, but to somebody else it may be very severe. So that's subjective, understand that. And you see the other kinds of things here, how many times did it occur? What was the nature of the relationship of the person causing the trauma to the victim? How did others respond to the victim? That's another big thing sometimes, after the trauma, whether was there support or was there denial? That kind of thing. So there's a number of different resources, and I looked for some of the ones in Alaska, and I found, this is supposed to work, but it's not. Um, I don't know why this. I was thinking I was going to be able to click on this, but it's not clicking for me. But here's a couple of websites at least that you can go look at. The last two links I think will take you to some things about Alaska Native youth and also about the Alaska Child Trauma Center. Some good resources there for you. Case management is also another model of intervention, and it isn't so much treatment focused as it really involves being an overseer and a manager of services. So many of our clients are come from multi problem situations, and need, most of our clients probably need services from a variety of resources in the community, and the case manager kind of looks for the gaps in services and tries to get those gaps filled with quality services, and checks in with the client to be sure that overall all those services are being provided. So this is a linkage, kind of there's a broker aspect to this, in terms of seeking services. There's a linking role as well. And this is so that really you're wrapping services around the client with case management, and really tailoring the client's the treatments being provided to the specific needs of the client. So should use a comprehensive assessment to determine the biopsychosocial functioning and care needs of the clients in determining what services are needed. And Gambrill is going to remind you, don't overlook the context. Don't just focus only on the biophysical or biopsychosocial. Well, the social part of that, I guess, talks about the environment. Be sure that we include the context of the client's life in determining what kind, in making your assessment of things. Of course, the client participates in decision making through this, and in planning and the implementation of the services. And a case manager is somebody, if at all possible, that ought to be somebody who's going to hang around for a while so that they really can oversee the client's, the services that are being provided, get in there and troubleshoot, and again, kind of advocate for the client at different times when services aren't being provided in the way they need to be provided, that kind of thing. So if somebody's around for a while, they're going to have an ability to be more effective in doing that, particularly also because they're going to have better relationships with other persons in the community. So here you can see what the strengths and limitations are. And one of the limitations I wanted to mention, that I wanted to point out, that there is an assumption that there are quality resources and providers out there that can fill the needs of clients, and that's not always possible, of course, and especially in the smaller communities, but even in larger cities sometimes. And so gaps in resources are going to exist, and the case manager is sometimes going to have to be very creative in filling those gaps. One or two more slides and we're done. I know this has dragged on a little bit for you. Gambrill reminds us that how we think about problems, that there's three kinds of statements when we think about them: factual, conceptual, and evaluative. Did the father assault his child is a factual question, right? A conceptual question, why did he do it? Gets a little less concrete. And evaluative, which has judgments in it, which is, was it right or wrong that what he did? So a question of fact, what is, and an explanation, why it is, are different from those of values, what ought to be. And the further we move away from facts towards theories and evaluations, the more removed we become from concrete data. So if we want to be sure that what we know is indeed factual, then we need to be careful about the questions we're asking, because we get wind up being led to faulty thinking and poor decisions. And writing case notes is a good example of this. Case note might say in a home of a a home visit, an unexpected or an unannounced home visit, because there have been complaints about the conditions of the home, and the workers' notes say, I walked in the door and there was a stench in the air. The carpet was filthy, and the kitchen was full of unsanitary objects. The child was emaciated and had a very pallid expression, or pallid complexion. Okay, a lot of vague kind of, although descriptive, very vague kinds of statements, so that instead of saying the place was filthy, you say there were stains on the carpet, there were dishes stacked in the sink with dried food on them, and flies landing on the countertop where something had been spilled. The child's clothing had tears. Her complexion was very, very pale. The toilet was overflowing, those kinds of things. Observations, not judgments, not descriptions, but observations, and that is the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Stick to facts as much as possible, and you're going to be able to communicate more effectively, and you're going to be able to, well, aside from if you're in court, to defend what your observations were, but also it's less likely that your values are going to be involved in that. So the more concrete our descriptions are, the more clear we are in describing what a person's done. There's a term called a referent. What are you talking about? And can you put your finger on that thing? Can you touch that thing? The more concrete the referent is, the less confusion will be created in your assessments and in your take on situations. So there would be less confusion about our meanings and what other people take from our statements. So the contextual perspective, which seems to be the wise thing, is something that isn't as popular as it might be. And Gambrill's belief is that it has to do with politics and control and power. The light shed may be far too bright for those profiting by deceiving others. And that's that's just something that as you read her book, you might pick up on that quote and think a little bit about it in the context of where she's saying it. But contextual views may be ignored or suppressed by public officials at times because of the political factors and social and economic factors, that, we're not going to deal with those kinds of things, or we can't do anything about that, or that's not politically expedient at this point. That doesn't necessarily mean you ignore them in your assessments of situations. Sometimes, though, you're not going to be able to you're not going to be able to use a contextual assessment in a way that's going to really help a client, and so the suggestion is that we balance our caring with a realistic appraisal of what we can do, and in the process find other workers of like mind to create a support network, and maybe to continue to talk about how to approach these things when your agency or the structure of the system around you won't respond to contextual assessments properly. One other thing is, in terms of our own theories and assumptions and our preferences about how we deal with things, it's important that we keep an open mind, because if we don't critically evaluate these things, they become, as Gambrill says, prisons that limit our vision rather than tools to discover what is false. So there's some deep thoughts for you. Gambrill gives you a lot of things to think about in her chapter, and I hope you do make sure you read that chapter closely. And that's it for now. Talk to you later.